So this is really what most people need. And the next couple slides we'll talk about higher levels of support. So when you recognize that somebody needs, something that goes a little bit beyond, friendly, compassionate, grief literate support. Many grieving people will also benefit from some form of formal support. So, a lot of hospice programs offer bereavement support. Funeral homes, most of them will offer some sort of aftercare. I will say both with hospices and funeral homes, the level of quality and robustness of those programs, it varies widely. So, some programs may have really strong bereavement support programs. Others may just not have a lot of resources. But all of them will offer something. And if they can't offer a really strong resource, generally they're competent enough to offer a referral to know where to go. So those are some things. Peer-led support groups, those can be really wonderful resources. Compassionate Friends, which is a lovely national organization for parents who've lost children, AFSP, NAMI, lots of good groups that are peer-led and can be really valuable for people. So this is kind of like the middle level. So folks who maybe need a higher level of support than just supportive friends and family. And then up here at the top, we also have, but some grieving people also may benefit from clinician-facilitated support groups or individual grief-focused counseling, and that's where groups like Caring Connections comes in. That's where what we're hoping to train other people to be able to provide is just like a higher level of clinician-facilitated, evidence-based grief support group that's different than a peer group. And then it's led by somebody who has, higher education and training that's really grief specific. And the other thing about this kind of support is it can be really easily tailored to the needs of the specific individuals. So like at Caring Connections, we offer groups, like we have a group that's specific to those who've lost someone to suicide, another one that's specific for someone who's lost someone to substance use or abuse. We also have like a loss of a spouse group. So it can be really, really nicely tailored to the needs of the people who are reaching out for support. So those are basically the 3 levels of support. Like I said, most people that we interact with who are grieving, really what they really need is compassionate kindness and grief literate people in their lives. And so if we can increase that, we'll be in good shape. Okay, so just really like this image. Y'all have probably heard of the stages of grief. That rings bells to most people. Okay, I want you to take what you know about the stages of grief and just like eject it from your brain. So what I like about this image is on the whatever side that is, right, left, your left, we have stages of grief. We have this nice little horseshoe where I think theoretically you go from here down into the trenches and then just kind of come back up and live happily ever after. Sounds lovely. What really happens is more like that image on the right there, that the stages of grief, while there is some truth to, we might touch on some of these pieces, we don't go in any sort of orderly, predictable pattern. We tend to be a little all over the place. But what I do like about it is that there is some movement in there. Like, we're not always in one place. There may be chaotic movement, but we are moving around. And so oftentimes I'll talk to grieving people and they will say, I'm regressing in my grief, like, because yesterday I was feeling really good and today I'm a puddle on the floor. And so I'm doing this wrong because I'm going backwards. And what I might say is, you're not exactly going backwards. You're going crooked. you're going in and around all those loop-de-loops, but that is actually forward. Like, it is actually taking you forward as you go. So just keep that in mind, that grief cannot be predicted in stages. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and her stages, they were never meant to be used as a way to understand the grieving process. They were always meant to be used as a way to understand the dying process, which is a little bit different. But they kind of got adopted by people who really wanted to apply them to grief, and for good reason. They really, our brains don't like disorder. Our brains like things to be predictable and easy. And so thinking that we could go through grief in these neat little stages, I think, was actually really, really satisfying to a lot of people until they actually had a personal loss themselves and realized that it didn't apply. Anyway, so I have made it my personal mission to argue with everybody who tries to advocate for the 5 stages. But anyway, this is just a nice image for that. So, that said, though, while most people do benefit from kind of just that low rung of support, just really kind, compassionate people, we do want you to know what to look out for if you're worried that somebody may be at a higher risk. So these are some of the factors that might increase somebody's risk. So like a highly dependent relationship with the person who died, a history of low distress tolerance, the death being perceived as traumatic, and I would emphasize the word perceived. We do have clinical definitions of trauma, but what matters here is their own perception. So if the death was perceived as traumatic, that does increase their risk. Multiple losses, whether that be in one specific incident or in a span of time, poor quality or unavailable relationships or lack of people close by. These are factors that can increase somebody's risk for challenging grief. Doesn't necessarily mean that they will have challenging grief. It just means that we might want to give them some extra attention and make sure that they have some awareness of resources. What we look for, well, I just spent 10 minutes telling you that the 5 stages don't really exist. That said, there are some benchmarks to look out for. There are some things that can kind of help us understand if a person is moving, if a person is moving in a good direction. And so some of the things that we kind of look for, being able to imagine life without the deceased. This doesn't have to be a good picture, but being able to think through, what might my life look like, what might my future look like. That's a sign that someone is making some meaningful full movement. Starting to reinvest love or care into new relationships or new ideas doesn't necessarily mean jump back into the dating pool, but it might mean how can we channel positive energy in a good way. So for example, my mother died 2 years ago, and I have been really, really impressed with how my dad has kind of channeled his energy and his love into his grandchildren, which has just been a really beautiful thing to watch. He always loved his grandkids, but I think he's taking a lot of that, that really doting, loving husband attention that he once paid toward my mom and expending that on his grandkids, and it's actually creating really beautiful relationships in my extended family. So that's an example of that. Does he want to remarry or date? I actually have no idea, but I would guess probably not. But he does want to love, and he wants to fill the world with love, which I think is really beautiful. Continuing bonds. What we mean by that is finding a way to continue to feel connected to the person who died. So one of my favorite quotes about grief is very simple, very short, from the book Tuesdays with Morrie. It says, "Death ends a life, but not a relationship." And that's something that I think, really is captured in this notion of continued bonds. So this is figuring out, how do I stay connected to my person? So maybe figuring out, my mother has died, but I'm still a daughter. She's still my mother. I still have that relationship. It looks different than it did before. It's not the same, sort of tangible and obvious to myself and the rest of the world kind of relationship, but it's still very real. It's just real in a different way. And so that's what we mean by continuing bonds. How do we stay connected to the person who died in a way that feels meaningful to us? And then this careful transition from a strength-based focus into a solution-based focus. What we mean by that is, oftentimes in the immediate aftermath of a death, the focus is really on, okay, how do we pick up these pieces? What do we do? How do we rebuild our life? What's happening? What tools can we access that will help us? And then we move that into what is more of a sense of, who am I now? Where do I go from here? What do I actually want my life to look like? Do you see the difference here? Okay, so these are just, again, these are benchmarks. They're not, it's not a roadmap. There's not specific, time stamps where they need to meet these markers, but these are things to kind of watch for. And if you're facilitating a grief group or offering counseling support, these are things to kind of help people help people move in that general direction. As a therapist, one of the things that I do think is important is this smaller bullet here. You cannot rush the cadence. So we don't want to rush people through their grief, but we do want to, help them understand that there is some progress being made, and there are some things that they can look out for that might help them understand if there's progress being made. And so these are some of those things. So what I might say to a newly bereaved person, I'm not going to be like, okay, your person died last week, so let's start reimagining your life. Let's start figuring out what your new life is going to look like. I'm not going to say that. I'm definitely not going to say that. But but a little bit later down the road, what I might say is, you decide when you're ready for this, but at some point, one thing you may start doing is start picturing your future and start picturing what that looks like. You don't have to do it now, but that may just be something to kind of put a pin in, and when you're ready, we can start talking about it. So I might plant the seed somewhat early on, and then when they're ready, we can revisit. Make sense? All right. I realize I'm not teaching y'all counseling skills. Y'all probably know a lot of great things, but just can't help sharing my stories. All right. And any questions about this? So some of the differences here between a sudden death and an anticipated death. And remember, suddenness is really as defined by the grieving person, not by the specific circumstances of the death. But there may be a sense of anticipatory, or there may be a sense of being more prepared or less prepared, confidence versus uncertainty in the nature of the death. Oftentimes when it's an anticipated death, we have a lot of the answers ahead of time. We know what's happening. We understand at least the technicalities of what was going on that led to death. In a sudden death, we don't get that. We may never get those answers, but we definitely don't get them ahead of time. Sense of assigning blame, like looking for ways to make sense of what happens, that can lead to pointing fingers, and then how the story is shared. So if you picture like a high school community, and they lose a student to cancer one year, and we live here in Utah. We tend to have really supportive communities. I can just picture how a community might respond to losing a student to cancer. They'd probably, come all out, have a vigil, decorate the street for the funeral, and all sorts of things. Same high school might lose a student to suicide or an overdose. How do you anticipate that community might respond? Yeah. We're getting better. We're moving in a better direction. But we do see that a lot. We see really starkly different experiences with how the story is shared, both by the grieving people and also by the community at large. We see really big differences in how supportive a community can be, and how people gather together. And so that's also just something to think about. Oftentimes with these more sudden, unexpected deaths, the community response is really different. We all have within us the capacity to do the work of grief. That's something that was born into us, that we all have. Most people, it's a matter of being able to tap into it. They don't need to develop the skill of grief, but they need to know where to access it. They need to know what that looks and feels like, and they need, and this is where you can be helpful, to be given permission to grieve. They need that kind of space. I'm sorry, I'm going to skip ahead just a little bit. So what I want you all to be kind of thinking about, as we work toward helping people in their grief, these are some of the things that are valuable. We want to understand their loss history. We want to understand their own coping skills, and we want to understand the meaning of previous losses. So, what has been your experience with losses before? What do you remember about your capacity for coping? What do you remember? What did you learn from previous losses that might be helpful for you in coping with this? And again, those may not be questions that you ask at that initial interview, but but they could be, they may be, it might be helpful for you, even just as you're thinking about how you could resource this person, how you could help them out, would be, what the meaning of their previous losses was. Do they, and this last one, assess their personal sense of failure and mastery. Like, do they feel like they have grown and changed because of previous losses? Do they feel like they've been defeated or diminished because of these things? Those are helpful things to know as we figure out how we can best support somebody. I'm skipping this video. Sorry, guys. So I think this is kind of where you really want to spend some time. Am I picking up on that? Okay. Okay. So let's talk about this. And when we say being present at a death, I don't necessarily mean being physically present as a person is drawing their last breath. That may be the context that you find yourselves in a lot. What we really mean is, how can we be mentally, emotionally, sometimes physically present when in the aftermath of a tragic situation? So I just really love this quote by William Shakespeare: "Give sorrow words, the grief that does not speak, whispers the o'erfraught heart and bids it break." I love that notion of giving sorrow words, and that's something that we can do as we give people permission to express their emotions, to feel their feelings, and to when appropriate, to talk about their grief. Um, what I encourage you to think about as you get ready to offer support and to offer care are these questions. How do you feel before offering care? Are you worried about causing a loss of hope? Do you feel hopeless because of the situation? And whose feelings are you trying to protect, your own or the families? So these are just, if you're taking those 10 seconds before entering a room to pause and take a deep breath and kind of slow your own self down a little bit, these might be good questions to be asking yourself. How are you feeling? Are there things that you're worried about? Are you in a place mentally, emotionally, where you can go in and be that compassionate person that you want to be? And if the answer to that is no, let the answer be no, and take another minute to center yourself. Take another minute. If you have another colleague, again, I don't know exactly how your situations play out, but like if there's someone else who can go in a specific situation, if you're not able to, see if you can negotiate some of those kind of things. If that's not possible, take another minute. Let your heart rate slow down a little bit. I have found that taking deep breaths is like remarkably powerful in helping to center ourselves. So I think these are just good questions to be asking yourself. And our director Kathy just really likes this this image here. This is the cheapest parrot in the pet shop. And why are they the cheapest parrot in the pet shop? Because they're a good listener, which is not really what we want when we're looking for a parrot, but it is what we want when we're looking for a helper. We want someone who can be a good listener. So be the cheapest parrot in the pet shop. Some of the qualities of effective helpers, the things we look for and we want to model for people. Some knowledge of grief and loss. Y'all are increasing your knowledge of that as we speak. Leadership, willingness to yield authority, not feeling the need to be the expert. That's another thing, when I think about my own professional journey that I eventually was able to sort of let go of, was this, I often felt this intense pressure to be the expert in the room. And one of the things that I have realized is that the grieving person themselves is the expert in their own grief. In your situations, those people are the experts in their own family, in their own situation. They may be, under a tremendous amount of stress right now and not able to access that expertise. That might be a way that you can help, is by yielding some of your authority and helping them access their expertise and knowledge. Modeling, demonstrating warm and compassionate communication. I am consistently surprised at how much conveying compassion, just of how long of a way that goes. If I convey compassion, even if I stutter or stumble over my words or call somebody by the wrong name, which by the way is really something I try to avoid, but if I can do those things while being authentic and genuine and conveying compassion, that is what people remember far more than anything else. Um, other just important qualities, values. Again, just conveying your own values. What are you honored by as you go into that room? What motivates you to take these steps? Um, your own skills, your own self-awareness, like acceptance of somebody else's skills, somebody else's expertise, and then style. So one of the things that I love about being a therapist, and specifically a grief-focused therapist, is that I can bring my own self to the work. Is that I can be my own authentic self. I use my personal communication style. I'll share my personal experiences with genuineness and when appropriate, not all the time. But above all, really that belief that there's not one right way to grieve. There's not one right way to think or to feel or to behave. There's no such thing as a wrong emotion. They're all welcome, they're all appropriate, and they're all hard. They all take some work to express. And so we're there for all of that. Therese Rando, a really widely known grief and loss scholar, this line here, just remember that you cannot take away the pain from the bereaved. Grieving people need to feel that pain. So, as compassionate people, we don't particularly love watching people suffer. So it is sort of natural and instinctive to want to say something that'll make it better, to want to take that pain away. But the pain that comes from grief is a transformative and I would say healing sort of pain. Like if you've ever like broken a bone or something like that. Have any of you ever broken a bone? Yeah. You can kind of remember how that feels. It's pretty painful. Have any of you ever like gone to the gym and worked out really, really hard and woke up really sore the next day? Also pretty painful. But there's two kinds of pain there. That pain that comes when we injure ourselves, when we break a bone, that pain is a signal that we need immediate help, we need an intervention, we need to do something to fix it, to make the pain go away. The pain that we feel after like hitting the gym really hard, it can be sort of debilitating. Like it can be painful. But it's a different kind of pain. Like nobody thinks, oh, I need to rush off to the doctor because I, ran 5 miles. We know the difference. We know the difference between the pain that comes from injuring something and the pain that comes from our body getting stronger. The same is true with emotional pain. There's emotional pain that comes from injury or trauma that usually needs an immediate help, an immediate intervention. And then there's emotional pain that comes from grief, which still needs some assistance, but is actually a pain of getting stronger. It's a pain of rebuilding ourselves. Does that make any sense? The trouble is we are like a little more in tune with our physical bodies than we are with our emotional selves, and so we have a harder time discerning the difference. So anyway, all of that said, we don't want to take away the pain from grieving people because that's what will help them to get stronger. That's what will help them to be able to actually move forward and move toward a better place in their grief. So try to resist that impulse to take their pain away or to say the magic words that'll heal things. Things that work, things that don't work. So there we go. Listening and re-listening, giving them an opportunity to tell the story, to talk about what happened. But also, like even more importantly than the story of the death here is allowing them to tell the story of the life of the person. Allowing them to talk about who that person is. What was meaningful, not just about the circumstance of their death, but also about their life. Over there in the what doesn't work, telling people your grief story. I, as a grief counselor, will sometimes tell my own grief stories, so I break this rule a little bit. But the difference here, and what we want to be, like kind of nuanced around, is talking about our own grief as a way of comparison versus talking about our own grief as a way of connection. And so, so saying things like, "Oh, you think you've had it rough? Let me tell you about my life." That's really different than, "Wow, I hear what you're saying," and I can remember those kind of feelings from when I've gone through losses. So, so I'm here with you. Do we see the difference there? It's not not rocket science, but but we just don't want to. We don't want to play grief Olympics and compare and compete with one another. Also, just important to note that medication does not help grief. There is no magic pill that makes grief better. People who are already taking medication for existing mental health conditions ought to continue taking those, but we don't necessarily want to encourage any new prescriptions in the aftermath of grief, particularly with sleep meds. And the reason for that is that a lot of grief is processed during that REM cycle of sleep, which sleep meds, while they may actually help a person fall asleep, they tend to disrupt the REM cycle. And so we don't necessarily want people to just sleep more but have it be unrestful. We would rather they just understand that sleep is lousy for a little while and that it will eventually get better. All right, skipping this part too. Sorry, guys, moving ahead. So with this, like we talked about earlier, there's nothing quite like a loss, and particularly nothing quite like a sudden or traumatic loss to remind us that we have very little control over the world. And for a lot of people, that's an absolute shock, because we live under the illusion of control for a good chunk of our lives. And so so for you all, I loved what you said a few minutes ago about just offering, making sure that people do have the choices that they have and making sure that that's known to them. So offering some form of control. What little things you can do to help them have some control over the things they do have control over when everything else is falling apart. That's a wonderful gift. That's something you can absolutely give. And when it's time to relinquish control, we want to offer them a safe, trusting way that they can do that. We want to help them feel supported and feel protected as they let go of those little means of control. That makes sense. How can you apply that to your own work?
One of our most unpleasant points of contention in our work is when someone registers themselves to be an organ donor, and the family may not agree with that decision, but it's been made and it can't be revoked, and so we kind of have to work through family with that, where this dying process may not look how they anticipated it looking, because now we are involved and we're helping facilitate something that was that person's choice, but it just kind of changes what their expectations of that process were. And so trying to find ways to keep family involved and give them some sense of control over that situation while the whole circumstance really is not in their control and donation is happening. So I think that's a challenging thing that we navigate.
Mm-hmm. I think within those contexts, reminding people what they do have choices around, even if they're small or even if they seem inconsequential to you as the professional, but who facilitates the donation, who is where in these situations, what the person is wearing. I mean, whatever it might be, helping people recognize what choices they do have, even if they don't really matter to you, they may matter to other people. And I think giving people that kind of permission is valuable. Other thoughts? Okay. Just another lovely little graphic here. It can often feel like we are, flying a trapeze without a harness. There is no substitute for experience. So the more you do this work, the more you convey compassion, the more grief literate and educated you become on these things, the more comfortable you'll feel going into those places and having those difficult conversations. So just a few things, and just when and how to refer for help. Again, just be aware of your own limitations, be aware of what you can and can't do in your role, and know that there are other resources out there. We love when we get referrals to Caring Connections support groups, and we are we take a really limited number of individual grief support clients, but folks are always welcome to call us to help gain access to some support. So we're always happy to be here. Know what other resources are available, and I know you offer some here through Donor Connect as well. Practicing good self-care. Again, I'm an advocate for really intentional, mindful self-care. So, those little things like checking in with yourself before going into a room, I think that's a really valuable form of sort of day-to-day self-care. And then I definitely encourage other kinds of self-care, like taking breaks from the work when you need a break, talking with your colleagues about your needs and about how you all can work together to support one another. There's lots of different forms of self-care. I don't not recommend things like, going and getting a massage or those kind of things, but I often think of that as sort of capitalistic self-care. Like it's kind of just what the the consumer-driven industry wants us to do, is figure out how to spend our money on self-care, which is fine if that's what you really need. But what I really encourage is to check in with yourself and really ask yourself, what do I actually need right now? And if the answer to that is I need the massage, go get the massage. But the answer might be, I need a day off, or I need some additional help. I need to advocate for myself more. And that's great too. There's a lot of different ways that we practice self-care. I just love this line by Emily Dickinson. I felt it shelter to speak to you. And, ultimately, if you walk away from this work having been somebody's shelter during one of the darkest moments of their lives, that's a victory. That's a huge win. And so just keep that in mind. May we be the shelter to other people's storms. Moving on. Sorry. And I'm going to skip this whole section because we have to end at 11:30. Is that right?
No, we had a second presenter that was going to come, but no longer. So
Okay. I'll try not to just talk for the next 3 hours, but but I guess it probably is helpful to know about ambiguous and disenfranchised grief, if I may. So ambiguous and disenfranchised grief are just two really kind of academic terms. They're not really clinical terms. So like we don't diagnose someone with disenfranchised grief or ambiguous loss, but I do want you to understand what they are. So an ambiguous loss is a loss that where there's a lack of clarity around the situation. So Pauline Boss, who developed the term ambiguous loss, she says a loss that remains unclear and thus has no closure. We don't really use the term closure anymore because that's not really what people are looking for as they go through grief, really looking more for adaptation or understanding of grief. But I didn't want to change Pauline Boss's specific words, so that's why that's there. But basically, like a loss where there's no official verification, there's a real absence of understanding of what happened. And because of that, we have a harder time putting the pieces together and making sense of it. So this might be like a situation where, a person is lost at war and their body is not recovered, or lost at sea, or someone goes missing and is presumed dead, but we don't actually know, a body is never discovered. Those kind of things can create a real sense of ambiguity. And some examples of that. So Pauline Boss breaks it up into two different types. So type 1 is a physical absence with a psychological presence. So a lot of like someone who's missing, someone who is kidnapped, doesn't return, like someone who's presumed dead, but we don't actually know for sure. And then other situations that are a little less I guess just a little bit more benign, but could still create these feelings of loss. Like a person goes away to college and we don't have that regular contact with them. A person is incarcerated. We know where they're at, but we don't have the ability to connect with them in the ways that we once did. Those kind of things create that sense of ambiguity. And then the second type is psychological absence with a physical presence. These cases might be, somebody who is physically present, but for whatever reason, it might be illness, it might be substance use or misuse. Those kind of things create a psychological absence. So, I have my dad's brother has dementia. And I was talking to his wife, my aunt, about that the other day, and she said, I feel like I'm grieving him, even though I'm also caring for him every day. So that's that kind of ambiguous loss. The person is still around, but at the same time not as they once were. And so, what a grieving person will experience with this are these kind of sensations. Leaving without goodbye, gone but not for sure. We don't know what happened. Goodbye without leaving, here but not really here. Those kind of sensations. That makes sense? I imagine you've seen some of this in your work. And so with that, again, there's this just real deep sense of uncertainty. So, we have a good guess about what's happening, but we don't actually know for sure. And our brains don't like to not know things. We like to be sure. And so this ambiguity is hard to live with. This definition by Pauline Boss: it is inherently a complicated loss. It's not because of the grieving person. It's not because of their disposition or their mental health. It's the factors of the death or the factors of the loss that cause this sense of ambiguity. So disenfranchised grief, on the other hand, these are related, but they're different. In a disenfranchised grief experience, the death is not like socially endorsed or accepted by other people as a significant loss. So this might be the person who like their goldfish dies and they're feeling they're close to the goldfish and they feel a real sense of devastation over that, but their community is like, it was your goldfish. And so their community doesn't actually give them the support that they need, even though they're feeling a real sense of loss. It might be situations where where the person who died was, maybe involved in some illicit behaviors or other things that make them, that make the rest of the community not feel a deep sense of loss, and therefore the family members are not well supported. So this looks a lot of different ways, and there's about 1 million examples of scenarios that could create a sense of disenfranchised loss. But what is important, I think, for you all to note is that people who are experiencing disenfranchised grief typically have much less support than anyone else because of their circumstances. And so that's where we want to be a source of support to them, and we want to recognize that they may not be getting it from friends or families members or their community. So we want to sort of double down on our efforts to convey compassion. Make sense? Because of the world that we live in, where we like to put a microwave version of grief for people, and we also, for better or for worse, tend to kind of judge other people's grief experiences. So these are just things to be aware of that people may be going through. And what we can do about this is be aware that these kind of losses create some complicating factors. They do make it harder for people to navigate those milestones we were talking about before, of being able to reimagine life without the deceased, being able to find new ways to channel their love and energy. These kind of experiences make that more difficult, and so we can help facilitate that process by being our kind, compassionate selves, no matter what their circumstances are, and by offering appropriate referrals. So this image here, this is just the course of a crisis for most people. So up there at the top, we have that little flat bottom triangle. They're very, very stable, very, very solid. We have a firm foundation. When an event like a death happens, what that does is it tips that flat bottom triangle up to its point, and all of a sudden everything is off balance. And so you probably can't really see this image super well from the back, but basically, our first response in the aftermath of a crisis is to attempt our tried and true solution. So you see him, he's trying to saw the beam with a saw. That works until it doesn't work. We get to a point where we come to a fork in the road, where we recognize we don't have, this is too big of a crisis. We don't have the tools for this. And so on this side here, on the left, the option would be to avoid the problem, to not address it, and attempt to handle it alone, work hard at inadequate solutions. So now he's trying to use his saw, the tool that he had before, but he's got nails that need to be hammered in. So he's trying to hammer in the nails with the saw. And what that leads to is that sense of continued disequilibrium. On the other side, acknowledging the problem and the need to change, turning to others for assistance, that's what causes us to gain new tools. That's where we figure out, we can discover some, it says up here, discover new ways of living and thinking, learn how to use new tools. And then that creates a new sense of equilibrium. And if this was in color, I would probably mark that the flat bottom triangle at the top is a different shade than the flat bottom triangle at the bottom, because it's not quite, we're not the same as we were before, but we are able to right ourselves. We are able to get back to that more firm foundation. And so where helpers come in is right there in that turn to others for assistance. Our job is to be there to convey compassion, and to help introduce some of these new ways of coping, these new ways of living and thinking. So just some just assumptions of care. Ambiguous loss is a relational phenomenon. It ruptures human relationships. So what we're looking for here is how we can rebuild those relationships, how we can help the person take care of themselves in a way that will lead them to a place where things are starting to feel like they're more that flat bottom triangle. So these are the things just to be aware of. Again, that grief is ongoing. Grief is always the aftermath. So there's no real sense of closure. We're not really looking for that. But what we are looking for is helping people tolerate the stress better, helping people be able to tap into and access their own coping tools better. And if we don't do that, these are some of the things that can occur. We don't like things being uncertain. We don't like things being unknown or hard. And so that can lead to these kind of experiences. And what I want to touch on is really just that bottom bullet of that feeling of stuckness. And a lot of people will come to me and they'll say, it's been like a month since my person died and I am not doing better yet. I must be stuck. I must be I must be grieving wrong. And what grief really looks like for most people is that zigzaggy, loop-to-loop, back and forth kind of line. And so, part of what I consider my job as a clinician is to help people recognize that that any movement that they're making as they move forward in grief is moving forward, even if it feels backwards. Like even if it feels like they're regressing, any movement is taking them forward. It may take them on a zigzagging line forward, but it's taking them forward. And so, I love this definition here of resilience, which has sort of been co-opted by therapists as a mental health term, but it was really meant as a metalworking term, where resilience was defined as like how much a steel beam could bend and be able to bounce back to its original state without losing its structural integrity. That's where resilience came from. We've adopted it into our mental health jargon. But that is basically what it means, is our human ability to recover quickly from disruptive change. So how we restore ourselves, not necessarily to who we were before, but to our capable selves that can handle these disruptions. So I just have to put in this plug for grief literacy. I've used that term, grief literacy, a few times during today's presentation. What grief literacy really is the capacity that every human being on this planet has to offer kind, compassionate support to people who are suffering. This does not mean that every human being on this planet needs to get an advanced degree and go through years of training and become a grief therapist, but it does mean that we can offer some form of help. And so that's what grief literacy is. Grief literacy is actually, it's becoming an international movement. So like in Canada, it's actually becoming law that people who are in like public-facing professions, police officers, teachers, other kinds of professionals, have to be trained in grief literacy. So in other words, they have to receive some education on compassionate grief support with whatever population they work with. We are working to promote grief literacy here in the United States and have it become a bigger a bigger part of our country's culture. Because, like I've said a few times, we don't really live in that world right now. We live in a world that likes to put grief in the corner, that likes to act like it's never going to happen to us, and that's just not not reality as much as we pretend like it is. So, you know, if you would like to, I encourage you to scan this QR code. This leads you to a little grief literacy Instagram account that we've created. This is just our way of creating really easy to swallow educational content on how to not be a jerk when you're talking to a grieving person.